Well, hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. We have a fantastic presenter with us today. His name is Cris Ippolite, and he's the founder of iSolutions, Inc., a FileMaker Platinum Business Alliance member. And he's here today to highlight how APIs, and in particular the new FileMaker Data API, has impacted his development strategies, as well as create new, effective business models for his clients. But before we get started, we'll cover a few brief housekeeping notes and have a quick chat about defining APIs. So for the best experience, it is strongly recommended that you participate in this webinar with at least a broadband connection. And if you have any problems or if you require online assistance at any time, please contact Citrix Technical Support at 888-259-8414. Now, throughout today's presentation, you're going to have the opportunity to type in and ask questions. So let's talk briefly about how to do that. Just go to the control panel, click on the question section, enter your question, and click on send. And we'll try to answer as many as time allows at the end of our presentation, but remember, you don't need to wait until then to submit a question. Programmable Web lists one of the most recognized repositories of APIs. TechCrunch went as far as labeling them the Journal of the API Economy. And recently, their API directory eclipsed 17,000 APIs. 17,000. Now, to give you some context on why that's an astonishing number, it took the first 5 years to total 2,000 APIs. But since 2014, nearly 2,000 APIs were being added annually. And that's just a brief glimpse into how APIs have matured from a curiosity to a key component in new scalable business models and strategies. So what are APIs? Well, many of you may already be familiar with this, but from a high level looking down, one way to think about APIs are as an intermediary between two or more software applications used to send and receive data. So they're like the waiter in a restaurant. So you, the customer, you send your order to the kitchen through the waiter, who subsequently brings that requested order from the kitchen back to your table. Now, previously in FileMaker, the waiter or that go-between for API integration were strictly the XML and PHP languages. So you were making queries to other applications via XML or PHP scripts. But FileMaker 16 introduced support for one of the most lightweight and most popular APIs called REST API. It's really exciting and opens up a lot of new doors for the FileMaker platform. Now, REST API employs web services or HTTP requests. So for example, let's say you have a bustling Etsy page. Your listings of custom FileMaker jewelry sets, they're really taking off. I've seen them, they look fantastic. And let's say FileMaker is handling the contact management area of your workflow. Well, in FileMaker, using the Data API, you may fire off a script that sends an HTTP request to get all of the orders from your Etsy page from the past 3 days. And maybe that's followed by a script that sends an HTTP request to post or add any edits you made back to Etsy. It can be as simple as that or as complex as you want it to be. And we could spend a week's worth of webinars diving deeper into FileMaker's Data API, let alone APIs in general. But the key takeaway here is that APIs aren't just about convenient methods for exchanging data. It's about exchanging value. Take the Etsy example we just discussed. Etsy is a fantastic option for small businesses to promote and sell handmade inventory. But maybe there's a more flexible option to manage customers and handle reporting. So FileMaker is brought in, and we're a perfect fit. As you know, FileMaker is a rapid, agile development tool. It's great for fixing inefficient processes, and we're able to transform along with ever-changing business needs like these contact management and reporting needs. Now, let's say you want to add a mass emailing strategy. Certainly, we could spend time developing our own mass email campaign manager in FileMaker, but what if we simply leveraged MailChimp, who already has a product excelling in this area? Again, this is the point of leveraging APIs. APIs allow applications to tap into the secret sauce of what makes other applications powerful and unique, i.e. exchanging the value of each application, resulting in even more efficient and even more productive deliverable for your client. This mindset shift equally helps you innovate faster as a developer. So for new projects, think of how quickly you can scale by bringing in valuable pre-built workflows. Think about obstacles in your existing solutions now that you can solve with APIs. And as the API library expands, think about how potentially dated core systems can become relevant again. And with that, allow me to turn our presentation over to Cris Ippolite, founder and CEO of iSolutions, Inc., who will share how some of his solutions are benefiting as players in this API economy. Cris?
Thanks, Ryan. Really appreciate that. That's a really interesting perspective on APIs. And what I wanted to show you guys now is really some hands-on examples of FileMaker custom apps integrated with APIs. And I also have an example of FileMaker acting as the API source that I want to show you. So let's jump right into some of the demos. I know people love those. So the first one I'm going to show you, just to kind of set the stage as to what the story is I've got a FileMaker Custom App here. And this is a FileMaker Custom App that's main role is for digital asset management. This is a pretty popular use of FileMaker because of FileMaker's container fields. But in addition to just storing assets, what we're doing is identifying different users of the system and presenting customized views to them. So in this case, we've got two users for this story. One of them is Bob, the designer. He logs into this digital asset manager, and he finds the asset that's been assigned to him. Now, Bob's task here is to go into the asset, download or check out a version of it. All of this stuff is native FileMaker functionality. And then when he's done making a change to the asset, he needs to notify his boss or his manager, Susan, so that she can approve it, because none of the new versions get added to the database as the new master until they're approved. So that's where this API comes into play. So like Ryan talked about, why not let the other apps do things, like in this case, speak to the notification center. Because our challenge is we want to make sure this approval gets to Susan, the manager, as quickly as possible, and she might not even be logged into FileMaker. She might not even be logged into her email at all. So in this case, Susan is actually logged into her iPad, doesn't have FileMaker open or doesn't have her email or anything. But now what's happening is we're checking in the asset. What we've done is we've just created this new version inside FileMaker. And you see this button down here called Request Approval. In addition to firing off some internal FileMaker scripting tasks, what this is also doing is communicating with an API. The API that we chose to communicate with the notification center is for Slack. Slack is probably something that most of you that are watching this already use for internal workplace communication. It also talks to the notification center. So rather than trying to get FileMaker to talk to the notification center, why don't we just send it over to Slack and let Slack do the heavy lifting? So here, for example, is Susan's iPad. She's, again, not connected to FileMaker. She's not checking her email, but she gets this notice. And not only does she get a notice in Slack, but it's been authored by FileMaker to have a custom message. It shows that it's from Bob to Susan. It gives details about the asset that Bob was working on. And there's even this masked URL that ultimately behind the scenes uses an FMP URL. So this is how she can go from being inside a Slack notification to now, as you'll see in a second, when she clicks on this link, it's going to send a message to her iOS, tell her to log into FileMaker Go, authenticates, discovers that it's her, and it also sends information over in the form of a script that tells us which asset she needs to approve. So all of that happened through a notification center, but it happened through Slack. So in this case, FileMaker was using the Slack API, and in this case, we're just adding a notification and communicating some data through it. Now the next step of this example comes with how we communicate with the customer. So we're going to use another API integration to solve that problem. And the problem is that the customer does not have access to our FileMaker system. It's great that we're storing our versions of all of the assets here inside FileMaker, but if our customer doesn't have access to these container fields, then how can they actually get the final asset? In this case, this is something that they've hired this firm to create for them, so it's really the product. So what we're doing here is we're employing a service that's called Box.com. I'm sure they're very familiar with it. It's very popular, and Box.com provides storage. It also has its own API. So in this case, when Susan hits the Approve button that you see on the bottom of the screen, you'll notice for a moment that we're communicating externally. You see here that you see that little flash on screen there. What's actually happened is we're transferring the data from the container field over to Box.com using the Box API. Not only that, but we're back in FileMaker, we're creating a custom email using FileMaker's send mail script that has a URL in there. See that URL that says https app.box.com? That's something that was generated and given back to us by the API. So in just the press of that button and using FileMaker scripts, we're able to move a file over to Box.com. We're able to author a custom email that, in this case, Susan can now send over to the client, and then make that a file or asset available to the client via Box.com. All of this done within FileMaker without having to leave the FileMaker experience. And as you see here, the client can then log in and click on the file, and now they can interact with the file, whether it's 10 megabytes in size or too big to email. It's all of that's taken care of through an API integration in FileMaker. So another story that I have for you that I'm excited to share is another series of API integrations. In this case, the story that we're going to be telling is about a real estate agent. So a real estate agent has their custom FileMaker Go app that's on their iPad so that they can take it around and go to different homes or open houses, or in this case, they're going to meet with a couple that has a home that they're thinking about listing. So the value of having this on the Go device, of course, is mobility. So the realtor can take their entire database right to the user's living room. So they sit down in the living room with this couple, and they're going to enter the home into the custom app. So here we're going to say we've got the home for the Joneses, and we're going to enter in some contact information, and we're going to enter in address information as well. Now here's the thing, we want to be able to convince the Joneses that they should sell their home, showing them what some of the comparables in the area are, but we don't have a listing of every single home that's ever sold or all the public records in here. But there is a service that does, and it's called Zillow. You're probably familiar with Zillow if you've ever bought a house or looked into selling yours. And what I just did there by simply entering in the zip code is we triggered a script in FileMaker to communicate with the Zillow API. So all the fields that you see on the left-hand side that say Zillow details, all that information came over from Zillow's database. And then in the middle, we were actually given a URL that comes over from the API that allows us to display all of this in an interactive fashion inside of a web viewer. So here users can see the latest homes that are sold, they can interact with a map, they can scroll down to see information about recently sold homes in their area. None of this has to be the burden of programming inside FileMaker. Instead, we just communicate with Zillow and Zillow's database on top of it, and now we have access to dozens and dozens and dozens, or actually for that matter, millions of homes that are covered within Zillow, and we don't have to have the burden of having all of those in our database. But still, as you can see, the experience for the realtor sitting down with these users looks like they've got access to all the data possible. So now the next phase of this is that we're going to, by looking at these comps, we're going to come up with an asking price, and the Joneses are delighted to see that some of the other homes in the area have sold around a $500,000 mark, so they're going to choose that as their asking price. Now back into sort of the native functionality of this custom app, the real asset for any realtor is all the individuals that they have access to who might be interested in a home. So in this case, the realtor has already logged several different potential buyers, including their high and low end ranges of the home prices that they're looking for. And by simply entering in an asking price, we use that as a key to create a relationship that then loads all of these individuals. Now the interesting thing here is that we want to communicate to these individuals as quickly as we can that the Joneses now have this house for sale, because obviously timing is critical. So as Ryan mentioned before, there is an application out there called MailChimp that handles all sorts of emailing. So why have to build all that into FileMaker when you can have MailChimp manage all of your lists and communicate with your users, send HTML emails, and even do the important part about managing opt-outs and bad emails. So what we're going to do is bring in, as you'll see here, I'll bring in the app for MailChimp. And this, I happen to be on the iPad Pro that you can access this online. And one of the neat things about MailChimp is that you can create lists. So it's really like they have their own database over on their end where you would create a list. In the case, for the most use for getting a list from a real estate standpoint would be, let's create a list for every potential buyer we want to email for each home. So you'll see that we already have a list on the bottom of the screen here, on the bottom of the list there for the 316 East Foothill Boulevard. That was actually created when we created the new home. So you see the new home button in the upper left-hand corner of the custom app. When we ran that script to do some of the stuff inside FileMaker, we also communicated with the MailChimp API to create this list. Now, if we look at the list, we'll see that the list currently does not have any contacts associated with it, and that's one of the challenges. When you've got an app that's like MailChimp that has its own database, you might fall into that trap of having to double enter everything. So every time that you added an interested party or a potential buyer in your custom app, you'd have to go and manually add them over in MailChimp. But we're using the API to handle that for us. So for example, if I hit the list or the add to list button that you see here next to Alan's name on the top of the list, I'm communicating with the Zillow API, and you see that Alan was instantly added to that list. I'm going to go and add a few other folks to it as well, Elliot, Jonah, and so on. And you'll see that as I hit those buttons and run the script in FileMaker, I'm also adding them to our list. So no more do we have to have two different lists that we need to manage or two different databases. We can do all the data management in FileMaker and just push that over to MailChimp. And the great thing about having those in MailChimp is now we can send HTML custom emails through MailChimp. And most importantly, if we get anybody who opts out of our list or we get a bad email, we can actually communicate that back to FileMaker, again using the API, And in this case, we don't have to scrub all of our data. We can actually get a message that highlights, let's say, custom formatting or something on an email in one of our potential buyers that says it's a bad email, or we can flag them for do not email so that they don't show up on our lists anymore. And continuing with yet another API integration, the next step here is that we want to schedule an open house. So of course we'll pull out our calendar app, in this case it's Google Calendar, and we'll look and try to find a day that works with both the individuals, the Joneses who are sending the home, as well as the real estate agent. Now we could do this through a API integration. So you can have a Google Calendar API integration that can check to see your calendar for open dates. And in this case we're actually going to use that API to add a date to the calendar. So let's say we all agree on October 13th. We hit the button to add a new event inside our custom app because we want to store this data as a history for all the different events that were associated with the Joneses. But we don't have to double enter it into our calendar because as we're entering the date and the time, the start time, and some other information like whether it was an open house or just a showing, and even description, all that is information that we can communicate over to the Google Calendar via the API by simply running the script in FileMaker. So I'll enter in come check out this new listing, and I'll hit the button that you see on the bottom of the screen that not only adds this record but now communicates to the Google Calendar, and as you see instantly adds this event to my calendar. Not only that, but it contains all the information that I've got stored in my database, the dates, the times, even some of the details and the email associated with it. So this way I can even invite the Joneses to it, or I can even invite all the potential buyers who may have responded to my emailer, and I can grab that information from MailChimp, figure out who responded, and click through and then actually add them as invitees. And then finally, the last integration in this storyline is, let's say the realtor is now meeting with a potential buyer. They meet them at a coffee shop somewhere. They've got the mobility of their app on their iPad Pro, and they pull up the Jones location, and they can instantly communicate with we've got one of these new card windows that we have available to us in FileMaker 16, and what we're pulling up there is a web viewer embedded in a card that is using the Google Maps API to plot the location in a perspective view on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we're actually using a sort of the new VR thing that's available in Google's Street View, so that the user can move the iPad around and it's like they're sitting right in front of that listing. Kind of some fun, exciting stuff there, a bunch of different API integrations all in one custom app. I also want to show you this one here. This app is pretty special. I'll explain it in a second here, but this has a pretty simple property. I've got an app that I created that's meant to be used on an iPhone, and the app is a books database. Got a bunch of books, and I want to create a repository of my books, and so I've created this custom app, put it on my iPhone, and you'll see here's all the list of where the books would show up. I hit that little button to create a new record, and now of course I need to populate all these fields. I got pretty big fingers and I can't really read that well, so entering data on an iPhone is kind of challenging for me sometimes. And so what I'm going to do is use an API to populate this data, and to do that I'm going to actually leverage one of the sort of hero features that FileMaker Go has, and that's barcode scanning. So I need to populate all these fields, even a screenshot of the book cover that's going to go in that container. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab the ISBN number off of the back of the book by simply using FileMaker's native barcode scanning feature. So I hit that button, run a script, and it instantly grabs, and that was a real time there where we actually grabbed all that data down from the Google Books API and it's parsed it all into all these fields. Now, how does that work? Let me show you just a brief under the hood. We don't want to get too technical with this, but I do want to show you how all this works. So here's that Books API. And really, I know this seems like a lot of scripting. There's more housekeeping scripting going on here than you'd think. But really, it all boils down to the insert from URL script step. And the URL that we're communicating with is this Google APIs. It really is that easy. You create a URL. And at the very end of the URL, I'm referencing a field called ISBN. That's the field that I populated when I took the picture of the barcode using the barcode scanning feature in Go. So once that field's populated, I can send that URL off to Google. Now, interestingly enough, what does that look like when I communicate to Google? Well, really, it's just like taking that same URL and putting it in your web browser. So you'll see when I hit enter on this, what Google sends me back is a bunch of data. It's all the data that I need to know about this book. And this format that you're looking at, some of you might be familiar with it, but this is called JSON. And JSON is very human readable, and for us database folks, it's actually kind of intelligent because we see data listed like a field label and then field data. So it's easy for us to view and understand, but the point is we want to be able to bring all this information into our FileMaker field. And that's where this script comes in. And I know it seems a little daunting, but it's really just a rinse and repeat of one script step. But let me walk you through how that process actually works. Of course, this happens in about a second or so, but I'm going to step you through it so you can see some of FileMaker 16's new native JSON parsing features. The first thing that I'm going to do is in that insert URL script step, I'm going to take the resulting JSON that comes back and I'm going to actually save it to a variable. You may or may not know that saving the return from an insert from URL script step as a variable was added in FileMaker 16, and it allows us to check that data to see if we got any data back in the first place. So in this case, I'm grabbing it, I'm setting it to a variable called $JSON. And then I'm using a new native function in FileMaker called JSON_getElement, and I'm checking to see if one of the elements called total items equals 1. I happen to have looked into the data, and I noticed that there's a header piece that comes over as the JSON that tells us total items equals 1 or more, depending on how many matching books came back on that ISBN. If it comes back with 0, I just have my script say, oh yeah, sorry, we didn't find it in the database. But in this case, if it says 1, we'll continue. So what we do is we set that data into a field, so now we have access to the data so that we can parse it. So what I'm going to use is another function that is native to FileMaker 16 called JSON format elements, which is sort of like a pretty print. It's going to clean it up and put it in the format that's most ideal for FileMaker for parsing. And you see here, you can tell it's even more human readable. It really just breaks down the fields or the element names and then the data that represents them. Now the idea is we want to isolate just the data within this cleaned up JSON that represents the book item, because there might be multiple records in this return, so I just want to take the first one. So I use the JSON_getElement again, and I'm pointing at the field called JSON in the books table, and I just want to pull items. You see items over here. Items is a parent to all this different data that you see indented, so I'm going to grab everything that's indented under items. So I grab all that information, I've isolated just the elements that I want. Now my task is I have to get the data that you see in this field into the appropriate fields over here on the left-hand side. They don't have to be on the same layout here, I'm just doing this for a demonstration. But for example, this field called eTag in the database has a corresponding element in the JSON, and ideally what I want to do is I want to get this data. Now we could do a really complex text parsing scheme here, but instead it's super easy to do that now in FileMaker 16 because we could use the JSON_getElement in conjunction with the setField script step, which is what that script was mainly made up of that I showed you. I can go through each individual field that I want to parse, and all I have to do is simply say JSON_getElement, go look in the field that's got the JSON or a variable, for example, and give me the data from the eTag and put eTag into the field called eTag. And I'm going to do that for every field that you see on screen here, including the URL that was provided to us in the corresponding return JSON that gives us the cover art for the book. So I know this is a lot to consume, and you probably wish I would have went deeper into this, but here's the good news. I've actually got a file, this exact books file, that I'm going to share with all of you. In just a couple moments, I'm going to show you a URL that you can go to, and you can download this file fully unlocked, and you can check it out and see these scripts for yourself. But before I get to that, I want to show you, kind of turn the tables a little bit on the API. What we've been talking about thus far has been FileMaker reaching out to other APIs and integrating additional functionality and data into the FileMaker Custom App. But I want to show you an example of FileMaker acting as the API source. So what we've got here is a FileMaker database on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we have a web application. Now this is something that you could already do in FileMaker without APIs. You could do PHP or other types of tag languages, for example, over the years that we could use to make our FileMaker data show up in a web application. But in this case, this web application has a very unique requirement. It needs to be available to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of users. So in that case, we need some really heavy-duty servers. We need a bunch of high-end technology on the back end. And what we're doing is we're still having FileMaker be the data source. That's correct. We can have FileMaker be the data source, in this case, for a web application with hundreds of thousands of users. Let me demonstrate to you. I'm going to update the field in FileMaker, and then I'm going to go into the web application and simply refresh so that you can see the data has been passed. And what's actually happening there is the web application is communicating with the FileMaker API. I'll change it back, do another refresh, so you can see within about a second or so, this data can be updated much like you're used to in other custom web publishing. So what's unique about this is the way that we've set this up in order to accommodate all this really high-end traffic. So let me show you a quick breakdown of how we got those things working. So you'll see here that we've got the all the different demos that I showed you. In the last demo, this one here with the web application and the database, if we look a little bit more into how that works, first of all, these are really the steps involved. We had to prep our file, and without going too far into it, in order to prep your file, it involves a couple of easy steps. You create a layout in your database, and that layout is going to have all the fields on it that you want to share via the API. That way you don't have to expose all of the fields in your table, and you could just isolate really just the fields that are necessary to be shared. Then you have to make sure when you put this file up on, before you put this file up on FileMaker server, that you have at least one active account that is assigned to a privilege set that has the new FM REST extended privilege associated with it. That will make it available via API calls. Now, specific to this deployment here, in order to get the high-end traffic, what we've employed is we've got FileMaker server and FileMaker Server 16's Data API, allowing integration with Node.js and Redis. Redis is a data caching system. So really what we're doing is we're populating the data caching system with all the data that the web application needs, and then the web application just communicates with the cache. But FileMaker is still the data backend. There's no other data intermediary here. So then that allows for the FileMaker data to be at the center of a large-scale web application like this. And then we're able to utilize the strength of Node.js's event-driven architecture to pull data created by the FileMaker's calculation engine, and then Node.js in this case pushes the data generated by the Data API to a scalable Redis cache for consumption via a React web interface. Kind of sophisticated, but I think really an interesting example of having FileMaker data be on the back end of a really high transaction volume web application. Just really one example. It's not, FileMaker's API isn't meant solely for custom web publishing, but we thought this was an interesting way to share this. Now, as promised, the Books custom app that I demonstrated a moment ago is available to you right now. If you go to isolutions-inc.com/API-webinar, you'll be able to download your own copy of Books. It's got some tutorial in there on how it works. It's got the same layouts I showed you for parsing. I urge you to take a look at it. And also, if you actually want to create a database of books, you can just load that onto your iPhone, and it'll allow you to do barcode scanning of valid ISBN codes. Additionally, if you want to share this information that's been covered here in this presentation with some of your colleagues, you can go to FileMakerAndAPIs.com at any time, and you'll be able to go to this web page where we've put together all sorts of information on the demos that are featured here. We'll even have the YouTube embedded of this webinar, and you can watch all the videos, and you can even go in the middle here and download the app if you'd like to. So I know what you're thinking. This is all really exciting stuff. Where do I go from here if I want to learn more about all this? Well, FileMaker, you see some of the resources that we have on screen here. To learn more about FileMaker's Data API or FileMaker as a data source, you can check out the FileMaker Data API guide that provides documentation on how you want to structure your calls to FileMaker. And if you want to make calls to other data sources, you'll probably want to know a little bit about REST API, so you can check out also curl and JSON articles in FileMaker's help section. And for any questions that you have right now, I'm going to toss this back over to Ryan to go through some of the Q&A that's been submitted.
Cris, this was really, really awesome. Thank you so much for presenting today. And it's really great to see leaders in the FileMaker developer community embrace these new business strategies, and you really shared some fantastic examples of API integration. So again, thank you for your time. All right, jumping into Q&A. If you haven't entered a question already, just go to the GoToWebinar control panel, click on that question section, enter your question, and click on send. We have a few questions here to start off. Cris, in FileMaker 16, would you recommend defaulting to REST API integrations over PHP or XML integrations?
Well, I think, you know, really what we have now is another option for custom web publishing, right? So it allows us to use some other technologies that aren't specific to PHP, which we've been used to all this time. So if you're more comfortable with JavaScript or different front-end technologies like I demonstrated here with React, you can build those in FileMaker, essentially author HTML with CSS integrated with some front-end technologies, and then have FileMaker as your back end. So that means you don't have to necessarily use PHP anymore, but you certainly can still continue to do that. So it's another option, a very powerful, scalable option that's now in our tool belt for custom web publishing.
Excellent. And can you touch on like the best ways to learn about APIs? Would you recommend just the resources that you just showed on the slide, or are there other ways for someone to kind of get started on their journey into learning more about APIs and learning how to use them?
Yeah, I think you want to start learning, understanding some of the tools that are available on the FileMaker side. So some of these resources that we're sharing here on screen, like the curl and JSON function stuff, you're going to want to have an understanding of the JSON functions, how they work. It's a lot easier than you think, I promise you that. But then when you're making calls to these APIs, you're going to have to learn a little bit about, at least some top-level stuff about curl. And then really the education comes from the documentation that's provided from the API source. So most of the time, these URLs are something like api.zillow.com or something. You'll go there and understand their API, so you know how you have to structure your URLs. And beyond that, you just have to be able to create a calculation that can output that URL in your insert from URL script step. I don't want to totally oversimplify it, but at the same time, I want people to at least check it out because it's a lot easier than you'd think.
Great. Next question. Do you know offhand if there are any APIs for QuickBooks?
Yes. In fact, I believe online the only way you can communicate with QuickBooks is via an API. There's some integration that's necessary. There's also some great products out there in the FileMaker community that help you integrate. But in order to communicate with online, the only way you can do that is via API. So that actually is kind of an interesting example where we show the advantage of API over maybe like an ODBC connection where you'd have to actually have things on your network or on the same desktop. So QuickBooks Online API integration is something worth Googling for sure.
Great. And will the REST and JSON work if called from a FileMaker 15 client?
Well, so if you're talking about bringing in data from the other application, you would need to, this depends. It really depends on the URL, because if you don't need curl support for the URL, in some cases you don't, like on that Google one that I showed you, believe it or not, I was actually, that actually was created in FileMaker 13 back in the day for another DevCon presentation I did, and I was able to get the data back in. Now, what I did not have in 15 is the ability to natively parse out the returned JSON. So in that case, since you don't have the really super easy to use native functions available, you'd have to do some pretty sophisticated text parsing. But it's doable if the URL does not require any curl support, and if you can parse out the data that's returned manually. But of course, I would recommend trying it in 16 because you got all the tools available to you there natively.
Great, and just a quick heads up, people, we have a bunch of people asking if you can show the link to the demo file download again on the screen.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
While you're doing that, a question about the FMREST extended privilege. Does that need to be enabled when you're connecting to other data sources?
Yeah, that's really where the confusion comes into play. It's really nothing different than, for example, if you want another application, if you're communicating with another application via ODBC, it's the same kind of thing. If you're in FileMaker and you want to pull data from another source, then FileMaker, first of all, it doesn't even need to be hosted on FileMaker server for that matter. It does not have to have the FMREST extended privilege enabled, because those two cases where you create the layout, you enable the extended privilege, and you host it on FileMaker server 16 are when you want FileMaker to act as the source of the data. If FileMaker is pulling data from other applications, it doesn't have to be hosted. It can just be on a desktop, but even if it is hosted, it does not have to have the extended privilege, because in fact, those applications are not communicating with FileMaker. So anytime you're the source, you need the extended privilege, you need to be hosted. If you're communicating with other sources, you do not.
Great. Question about tokens and API. When you implement a solution to many customers, is it one token for many customers, or would it be one token for a customer who makes a call?
That's a good question, and that's something that's likely going to be dictated by the API that you're communicating with, since that's where that management will happen. Actually, there's in the application I showed you with the web publishing, we actually have one token in that case. So, and that's really the only thing that's communicating with the API. So it really depends on what you're communicating with and how you've structured that, but you do have some flexibility in that area.
Perfect. And is FileMaker Server required to make calls to other data sources too?
No, so that's just like what we talked about before. You, in these cases, all the demos I showed you, they were all running on the desktop. They weren't even hosted. So FileMaker Server is only required to provide, which is fantastic functionality, but to be able to provide the ability to hit a FileMaker data source and extract data from it via an API.
Excellent. And it looks like we're having a bunch of questions about whether particular software applications have APIs that you can integrate with FileMaker. All you have to do, really, kind of like what we talked about with the QuickBooks Online, just do a quick Google search. FedEx API, I believe there's a REST API. Constant Contact, that also has a REST API. Just do a quick search online, and if they have an XML, PHP, or a REST API, then we can certainly talk to those solutions. All right, on behalf of Cris and on behalf of FileMaker, it was our absolute pleasure chatting with everyone today. Hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the FileMaker Data API and API integrations, and I definitely hope to see you guys on another webinar soon. Have a fantastic day, everyone.